Well, kia ora koutou. This is a short video, hopefully short video, on how to structure your answers for the upcoming exam based on the test. This test and the exam are going to be very similar sort of format. So this will hopefully help you for your exam, especially if you didn't get the marks you had hoped for in the test. I've had about 15-20 people come to my drop-in sessions and ask me why they didn't get a better mark. And time after time, it comes down to two really simple things. Number one, answering the question. So many people just didn't answer the question. They told me everything they knew, but they didn't actually address the question. And number two, structuring your answer in such a way that you make sure that you have not only demonstrated your knowledge, but you've been able to apply your answer to a specific situation. With an open book test, as I said at the start, I am going to be asking far more application questions. If you tell me what we have talked about in class, cut pie, you might pass at best, but that is not going to help you in the long run. I need you to show that not only you understand the material, but you can apply it into a very different situation. So can you take what we've talked about in class and show me that this works in the real world, in your own life, whatever else it might be? So just knowing the stuff in an open book test is not good enough. We are not training you to regurgitate knowledge. We're training you to apply knowledge into real world situations. This is why this is a second year class. Third year, it's going to go up a different level as well. I know some of you have come from fields like finance, economics, accounting, where it can be very formulaic. I've memorized the formula. Here is the answer every single time. No such thing in the social sciences, no such thing in these sorts of classes. You can still have a logical formula to answering questions, and that's what I'm going to go through. And if you follow this formula, you will do much better. So let's take a look. I don't know why it's doing this. It's pissing me off now. All right, so this is how I've been telling people to structure their answers to help them make sure that they cover all the aspects we're really talking about. So if you've come and talked to me or you've sent me some material to mark, I've kind of said, have you followed this process? And this is a really simple little acronym that I use called C in order to see if you have actually addressed the question at hand. So the first thing is make a statement. 1 or 2 sentences, tell me what you think. This is just straight out answering the question. I think this. All right, I think that culture is important. I think culture is complex. Whatever else it might be. We'll go through a worked example in a second. Tell me what you think. Stop there. Make it clear that you're taking a position, answering the question in particular. So if you've gone through a question, highlight the important parts as we talked about before. Tell me what you think. Explain what you mean by that. Explain why you think that way. Explain what might drive you to have that perspective. At this point, you can drill down and expand upon your statement to say, here are the different elements of culture or whatever else it might be. We'll talk about this in a second. And then give a specific example. Apply to a specific case. Remember, you can use your personal reflections. That's okay, but that's the starting point. Give me evidence of how this might work in an organization, in a business. As second-year students, you absolutely should be aware of different businesses out there. You should be aware of different companies and how they operate and how they should incorporate the things we've talked about in class. If you're preparing for the exam, every single slide in the class, I would go through and say, I can see how this works with Apple. I can see how this works with New Zealand Trade and Enterprise. I can see how this works in the Reserve Bank. So you don't need to have to think of an example on the spot, but you've already applied it. Remember, open book tests, much more applied. If you just make a statement at the start, you're not going to get many marks, maybe 1 or 2 out of 10 at best, because we've already told you that. You know that, you've got the evidence there, you can look that up at any sort of time. But when you start to explain and go beyond, okay, we've got a couple more marks, but the application, the actual example, showing that you can put this into practice, that's where you get the majority of your marks. Let's go through a worked example to show you how this works. Okay, so this is question 1 from the test. A really straightforward question on the face of it, actually quite a hard question. The way you know it's a hard question, let me get my highlighter out, is that it's worth 10 marks. So 1/5 of your marks is going to come from this question. Straight away, if it's 1/5 of your marks, remember I told people this ahead of time, 2 to 3 paragraphs at the bare minimum. We're looking at that sort of answer. When people write 1 paragraph, maybe 3 or 4 lines, the likelihood of you passing, even if you're really concise and really to the point, is really, really low. So 10 marks, 2 to 3 paragraphs is really what we're looking for. Okay, so in week one, we learned about what culture meant. This is a hint. Go to week one. All right? Tell me what you think. Tell me what we've talked about in time. What culture meant. Culture was described by Raymond Williams as one or two of the most complicated words in English language. All right? We haven't even got to the question yet. We are just giving you a background, directing your thinking to a specific area. Why? There's a big word there. Keep that in mind. Do you think culture is so complicated? All right. Now this, on the face of it, seems like a really simple question, and this is why a lot of people kind of jumped in and said, I think it's complicated because it's made up of various parts or something like that, and they left it at that. You're not going to get more than 1 or 2 marks out of 10 for that. You really need to expand upon it. So let's apply the SEE approach, that C approach, and this is how I would have answered this question. Okay, so I would have started by putting together a structure where I start with answering some really basics, some definitions to start with. What is culture and what are the elements of culture? That's a statement. So culture is made up of multiple different aspects: language, upbringing, experience, food. All these different things come together to form culture. Explain what, and this is kind of into the second part, explain what culture is and what Williams is talking about. This becomes super complex because when you have different elements of culture and many of them are unseen, that becomes really difficult for you to understand what culture is, what we mean by culture, how that is manifest in the real world, how we express our culture, and given a specific application. So give me an example. So for example, if we were going to talk about what New Zealand culture is, it's really difficult to define because New Zealand has bicultural elements. So there's the European settlers as well as Māori, but then we've got Pacific. Then we've got a huge number of Asian immigrants, and Asian can become multiple things. We kind of lump Asian into one thing, but I'm Indian and I don't act like other Indians, and that's demographic and genetic. And then we have Asian with regards to Chinese, Vietnamese, Malaysian, Japanese, Korean. All have very rich, complex histories, all who have settled in New Zealand, but we call them Asian. So already you have got quite a long paragraph as to what culture is, and we haven't even started answering the question. Even if you did that as a starting point, you're looking at 2 to 4 marks max, all right? Because we have basically just looked at what culture is, and we've started to answer the question. Let's expand upon this. Why is it so complicated? So next paragraph, start to pick out the different aspects. So give one situation where culture is complex. Maybe it's the invisible aspects. So you don't know someone's culture really until you start engaging with them and realizing that they see the world a different way based on their culture, based on their upbringing, based on their experiences. We bring a different lens. There's your statement. Explain what you mean. Well, 2 people might have grown up in very different, look very similar, and have very similar sort of demographic features, but have completely different upbringing. So I met one young person who grew up in the UK, another person who is of European descent grew up in New Zealand, and they bring very different perspectives to the world, even though British culture and New Zealand culture, Pākehā culture, typically are very similar. Very different values that come up. So we need to show that just because they have a separate upbringing, they can bring a different lens to the world, and that makes a culture so complex. And give a specific example. So this is where you can start to specifically talk about maybe your personal experience. Here's me growing up in New Zealand, and here's how I have clashed sometimes, or maybe just brought a different perspective to a situation because I come from this culture and they come from that culture. That's a personal reflection. A better one, and that's okay, you can start there. A better one might be, here's how we have different cultural norms within workplaces. Here's how different cultural norms manifest themselves. I remember moving from one workplace to another, and within that workplace there were different cultural norms and what is expected based on the values that were never really expressed. It was just their lived experience. And here's how businesses can start to clash with customers or clash with workers, whatever else it might be. That's a little bit better. Now, when you start going to really macro level, you can start talking about, well, we talked about in class about this company who really didn't understand Chinese culture when they went and worked, started to export into China. Or there's this company that really didn't understand what it's like to work in New Zealand, and then people really didn't adopt. their values the same way. That's a better example where you're now applying it not just to personal experience, not just to personal examples of small businesses, but what we're talking about in this class, which is business and society and culture. That's going to get you to the pass, maybe up to the B mark. So you're getting much, much better here. Now, the final step for me is where you start going and do another example. Give me another situation where culture is more complex. Why is it becoming more complex, maybe? Show me why culture is evolving, why culture has evolved over the millennia. Give another situation why it's getting more complex. So I would have answered something like, this is only going to get harder, this is only going to get worse because we have increasing multiculturalism in New Zealand. We have different shared values. So people might look very different and have very similar culture, or the opposite. People look the same, have very different cultural norms, very different cultural backgrounds. So the idea of what culture is, what a shared value is, what shared norms are, is becoming more and more complex. Demonstrate what you mean by that. So you might have people who come to class or might come to the university and have very different past experiences, and they might have come from blended families. So I met a young man who dad is Pākehā, mum is Filipino, and he is a mix of both Filipino and Pākehā. That's a great example to start with, and to say, for example, my parents have come together, blend of cultures, and I'm kind of somewhere in the middle where I'm not really Filipino enough and I'm not really Pākehā either, because people see my skin color or my slightly different, and that became clashes sometimes because people thought I was Filipino or they thought I was Pākehā. Really, my culture is 50-50 or both, something like that. That could be a specific personal example. Now expand upon that. How does a global entity like Apple operate within New Zealand and share the values, norms of New Zealand whilst being very true to their nature? Now, Apple, you might argue, that says, no, we've decided not to adapt to New Zealand culture. We're going to bring what we feel is important, the norms we feel are important, to New Zealand, and if people like it, they can buy into it. If they choose not to like it, perfectly fine. You don't need to buy our product. While you might have other companies that say, we really want to embed ourselves authentically within New Zealand, so we'll adapt our international organization and what we do overseas to what matters to New Zealand. There's an example of how an international company has adapted in order to fit in and have the shared values of people within New Zealand. That's another example of how it's becoming increasingly complex in a growing multicultural world. So already you've got 3 paragraphs of increasing complexity, which are really straightforward to answer if you structure your answer in this way. Statement, explanation, example. Statement, explanation, example. Each paragraph should have those 3 elements. Move on to the next paragraph. If you're able to take a couple of seconds to structure your answer as well and say, this is how I'm going to start, give a definition to start with, 1 or 2 marks, at least you've set the foundation. Then why is it so complicated? Answering the question, and then increasingly saying, here's different examples of it. Grow beyond it, you're going to start getting into the B plus A range, and that's where I know a lot of you want to be. And already you can see how 1 paragraph really isn't enough. We had a lot of people who said, here's everything I know about culture, this is what Williams talked about, here's what these other people in class talked about, but that's really only answering this top bit up here. And so the chances of you getting too much more than 1 or 2 marks is kind of low. And so they were a bit disappointed because I said, but I wrote like 2 paragraphs, but you never actually got down to why is this so complicated? That came in the last paragraph, maybe with 1 or 2 lines. So this is where you start to get marks. And this is where you start to get into the A range, where you start drilling down more and more and more. Another technique that I use with answering questions, if you want to start to go beyond the surface level, and some people said, we have shared values, we have shared norms, but also there are differences in our culture. Okay, keep asking yourself which means, or that means. So for example, you can say, I am ethnically European, for example. I'm not, but let's say you're answering the question, I'm ethnically European, but that is very complex because we don't necessarily have shared values within what I think is Pākehā culture. which means two people can look the same, but actually they have very different political views, which means just because we look the same doesn't mean we actually agree on things, which means that understanding culture becomes very complex because it's not just based on demography, which means we can start to understand what culture means from multiple perspectives. Political would be one of them, ideological is another, cultural norms based on how my parents raised me in the country versus my friend's parents raised them in the city, very different, which blah blah blah. Keep asking which means, and that goes beyond that surface level where some of you were starting to more deep understanding. Okay, so hopefully this has been useful. This is a lot to try and take in, and you're probably thinking, I never realized it was this complex. Trust me, as you get to second year, third year, especially within the social sciences, we expect you to start thinking beyond what the question is asking and start to think how I can structure this to really understand the different elements and drill down to the really complex parts. So the exam will be very similar. Take a breath. I'm going to make this exam shorter than the test so you have more time to think, but that means I also want to see more complicated, developed answers if you want to get into the A+ range, and I know you have the ability to do this. If you have any questions about this, absolutely cool, stick it in the forums. I can do another video like this if you want, just tell me and I'm happy to help you out. All right, ka kite anō.